He's talking a little bit about Exodus 14 and how God led them to the promised land via a dead end. What are we talking about here this morning? What's the lesson that we can learn from Genesis 14, Exodus 14? What's the lesson we can learn from that?
Well, we see in the beginning that when they left Egypt, everything was going well and pretty good until they got to the Red Sea. That's when they saw Pharaoh's army chasing them. And now they was hemmed in. They had the sea in front of them. They had the mountains on the side, so they couldn't go left or right. They couldn't go to the sea, go through the sea because of the sea. And so the army was chasing them. Pharaoh had changed his mind. He came to take them back to Egypt. So then they started complaining to Moses. And so that pillar of cloud moved in between them and the army to block them from attacking. And then Moses stretched out his arm, and God parted the waters. Overnight, the land became dry because of this wind that was keeping the waters apart. They were able to walk through, and then Pharaoh's army came through, and they were all drowned. So the lesson he was trying to get them to learn was he wanted them to see themselves. He wanted them to learn how to trust in him instead of them trusting in what they could see. And so this is a lesson that we must learn when we go through our trials. This is the song that you talked about. He wants us to sing this song of praise and thanksgiving, giving even through the trials, and not just when things are going the way we want them to go.
In the chapter, Exodus 14, verse 13 and 14 really stuck out with me. But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." So that's our problem most of the time. We don't want to stand still. And when we do, first of all, we're afraid because we can't see what's going on. Like maybe there's maybe electric bill due. And here's today, the 16th, and it might be due tomorrow, the 17th. And you're like, okay, I don't have any money. I've checked all of my accounts. I can't overdraw, anything like that. So we're afraid. And so at that time, we need to stand still and say, okay, Lord, June you paid it, so you can do it again in July, so I'm just depending on you. So I went as far, in the Sabbath school lesson, it says, why did God bring the Israelites to a place where he knew they would be terrified? So my answer was, protect them from Pharaoh, first of all, and then let them see God is in control and will take care of them. So they had to learn this lesson. That's why he brought them there. That's why he takes us to places that we think, I just can't handle this.
Yeah, sometimes we see our circumstances as impossibilities. We see it as an impossibility. Impossible for God to bring us through the trial and difficulty. And so when we face our difficulties, you guys are correct. And I like what you said, how the lesson for the Israelites was God leading them. First of all, he led them to the Red Sea. They were going in and they had all of these possessions that they had, the children, the young ones, and they get to this sea, and they look back, and Pharaoh is breathing down their necks, and all of a sudden they see an impossibility. How are we gonna get through this? We ask the question sometimes ourselves when we face difficulties: How am I gonna deal with this? How am I gonna deal with that? And God, and the lesson that God wants us to learn, again, like you guys said, is that he wants us to trust him totally. That's the lesson. We have to learn to trust God. But that's not something that we have always done. We have trusted God to a degree, but not completely. And so because we haven't trusted God completely, it's difficult to trust God completely in a difficult circumstance. And that's the lesson that he wants us to learn today, that we need to learn how to trust him totally and completely. And secondly, I think that when the pillar moved from the front to the back, I believe that God was revealing himself to the Egyptians. He was showing them who he was. And so they needed to know who he was as well, to know that he was their God. Because Pharaoh had already asked Moses, who is this God that they serve? He already knew that they served a different God, but he didn't believe. And so the pillar moved from the front to the back to reveal to the Egyptians that I am the God who takes care of this people, and they follow me. Sister Sadie.
And in addition to that, even though God brought them to a point that looked like this is it, we can't get over the sea, and these people are behind us. When God parted the sea and allowed them to go through, he allowed the Egyptians to come into the sea, but then they were annihilated. So the enemy that had pursued Israel was no more. And not only that, the fear and dread of them spread abroad, so that as they traveled, this was also protection from them, because the people knew, okay, these people are protected. We better not bother them.
I like the way the lesson brought out under Sunday. During these difficulties, the key to knowing when we are truly following God is not necessarily the absence of trials or pain. And that's what we talked about earlier. There are some people who think, okay, I follow God, everything's going to be all right. I'm not going to go through any trials or tribulations. But it says they're not necessarily the absence of trials or pain, but rather an openness to God's instruction and a continual submission of our minds and hearts to his leading. So when we allow him to lead and guide us, even though we go through our trials and pain, and God already know ahead of time that July 16th, this is going to happen or that's going to happen, he's with us. He promised in his word to never leave us nor forsake us. So that gives us assurance that we're okay. We're going to be okay.
Yeah, God wants us to see ourselves. And if we think about it, how do we respond to a crisis?
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's trying to tell us with this story. How do you respond when you lose your job at the beginning of the month, when all the bills are due, and you don't have any, and you live paycheck to paycheck? How do you respond when you are required to come to work or lose your job on Sabbath? And so, just like you said, these impossibilities, to us, it seems impossible. But how do we respond to that? Some of us panic, and some of us do things that we shouldn't do. But the lesson that God is trying to teach us, like with the caged bird, is to sing a song of praise and thanksgiving and have trust in God. Yeah. He wants us to trust him in all of our crises so that we don't lose it and panic when we see dangers and circumstances like this that are difficult.
And to add to what you're saying, when we find ourselves in those, you asked the question, how do we respond? I think we're only going to respond one or two ways. We're going to trust in ourselves, or we're going to trust God. One of the two. And most of the time, we often trust in ourselves because we're used to being able to think we're being able to do something, so we trust in ourselves. We don't trust God all the way. And I have a question. I want to do the supplemental reading. Then I'm going to ask this question, and we'll move into Monday's lesson because it leads us into that. It says in the supplemental reading, it said the children of Israel seemed to possess an evil heart of unbelief. They were unwilling to endure hardships in the wilderness. When they met with difficulties in the way, they would regard them as impossibilities. Their confidence in God would fail, and they could see nothing before them but death. Said the Lord was willing that they should be brought short in their food, meet with difficulties, that their hearts should turn to him who had hitherto helped them, that they might believe in him. He was ready to be to them a present help. If in their want they would call upon him, he would manifest to them tokens of his love and continual care. So a lot of times, all we have to do is call upon God. He says in one text, he says that if you seek me early, you'll find me. Don't wait till you get deep in the circumstances. When it comes upon you, start your prayer right then. Don't wait until the last minute when you thought you've done all you can do and start to pray. And now call upon God at that moment. So at the bottom of Sunday's lesson, in 14:31, Exodus 14:31, read that text for me. Somebody, you have that, Mark? Read that text, Exodus 14:31.
Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
It said that they believed in God after they saw what God did at the Red Sea. You laugh and you know where I'm going, huh? They saw what God had done, and everything. And the question is, what lesson did the Israelites learn from this experience? What lesson did they learn?
In this case, they learned that God would protect them and fight for them.
Okay. So in Monday's lesson, we're talking about bitter waters. The question is, when they got to the bitter waters, did they really learn that lesson to trust God completely? That's the question.
Before we move to Monday, can I back up with the question? At the bottom of Sundays, why is trusting God sometimes so hard, even though we may know many of the wonderful promises he has for us? What do you think?
Why is trusting God sometimes so hard?
Even though we may know many of the wonderful promises he has. The Bible is full of them.
That's a question for the class. Why is I'm depending on my Bible scholars. I got one with his hand up. Come on, sir, to the mic. Go ahead.
I may not answer your question, but to go back to we're in trials and tribulations. We see Israelites and God moves them and helps them, part the Red Sea and everything. He gets them in the